There are some major changes coming to the TSP in 2026, and as a federal employee, this could seriously impact your tax bill, your withdrawal strategy, and how you take the money, and how much money you get to keep in retirement. The good news? Well, if you start planning now, then there are some really powerful tools and strategies that I'm going to share with you that'll actually help you to continue growing your wealth, reduce your taxes in the long term, and help you keep more of what you earn. So let's jump in. Why is 2026 such an important year? It's been a while since we've seen this many changes come to fruition inside the TSP. So first, there are some provisions from the Secure Act, which 2.0 came out a few years ago, and some of these provisions are now going to go into effect in 2026. So you got to know about that one. There's also new TSP features and changes within the plan itself that are going to be really important. So we'll get to those. And then we also had one of the largest tax law changes recently. We call it OBBBA, so the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, as it's known. And there's a lot of factors about that law that's going to impact federal retirees and the way that you're going to want to be planning. So let's get right into these. So let's start with the number one feature that we've been hearing about and people have asking questions about, and that is the in-plan Roth conversions feature that's going to be available inside the TSP. Now, there are a lot of complexities around Roth conversions, so I want to cover some of these so that you can best use this tool to your advantage. First, just a quick refresher, what is a Roth conversion? When you put money inside the traditional TSP, that is pre-tax. At some point, you might decide that you want to actually pay the taxes on that, convert it into a Roth. Why would we do that? Well, now inside the Roth, the money gets to grow tax-free, so that tax-free compounding can be a very powerful tool in retirement planning. Okay, with that out of the way, we want to think about when does it make sense to do a Roth conversion? Well, from a planning perspective, I'm going to cover that in just a few minutes, but let's first look at how the TSP is implementing the Roth conversion itself. So first, what we're going to want to do is determine how much money you want to convert from the pre-tax traditional and move it into the Roth TSP. Seldom do you want to do the whole thing. You want to be really careful because every dollar that you convert is adding to your taxable bracket. So at some point, the more dollars you add, you're going to hit the next tax bracket, and then suddenly you're actually paying more taxes than you were before. So you want to be careful with this strategy. So the kind of tax that you owe on this is going to be ordinary income. Ordinary income is also known as the same kind of tax that you pay on your salary or any other kind of retirement account distribution. So that's important to know, and we'll talk about why in a few minutes. Now, once the money is inside the Roth, what kind of investment should we consider inside a Roth? Well, if we think about what does portfolio growth do in terms of taxes, the more growth we have, the more taxes we have. That's how it works. So it stands to reason that you may think about using more growth-oriented investments inside the Roth component itself, because all of that growth that you have an opportunity of participating in is going to then be tax-free. So that is a really solid strategy when we do Roth conversions inside IRAs for retirees. That is typically what we are doing. The next thing you want to think about is how much should you be converting, and should you actually be doing a Roth conversion? Well, why would we not do a Roth conversion? Let's talk just for a moment about the idea of when it makes sense to use pre-tax versus the Roth. When you do a pre-tax retirement contribution like the TSP or any other retirement account, let's pretend this is your income level. And we'll assume that each one of these lines is a different tax bracket. Your income while you're earning a salary might be somewhere here, or maybe it's here, maybe it's somewhere in the middle. Okay, so considering where these brackets are, these might be some higher brackets where you're paying maybe a little bit more taxes. So in those years when you're in higher tax brackets, maybe it makes sense to take the tax deduction because you get the deduction at a higher percentage if you're in a higher bracket. And then when you take the money out of the retirement account, you might be in a different tax bracket. You might be all the way down here, you might be here. So if you take the pre-tax deduction, you want to do that in years that you are in a high bracket, or you want to do the conversion or a Roth contribution itself or a retirement distribution where you take the money out in years that you are in a lower bracket. So from a financial planning perspective, this is how you should be thinking about pre-tax versus Roth. Do I do a conversion or not? So to recap, We want the deduction in years that we are in higher income brackets, and then we want to pay the taxes, or either by doing a conversion or a distribution, in years that we are in lower tax brackets. When might you be in a lower bracket? Well, that really depends. If you're not earning an income anymore, chances are you might be in a lower bracket. But if you need to pull the money out of your retirement accounts to live, that stacks on top of your taxable pension. So you might not be in as much of a lower bracket in the future. Where it really matters is as your accounts are growing over time, eventually you reach this magic age of 73 or 75, depending on when you were born. And now you have to start taking required minimum distributions. For the types of families that we work with, most of them have what I call an RMD problem, which means the amount of money that they are projected to have to take out is likely to push them into a higher bracket in the future. And sometimes, because it's required every year, they may be stuck in those higher brackets. When you do a Roth conversion earlier in retirement, and you may time it maybe for when you retire because your income goes down, and then at RMDs, your income goes back up again. This window of time in between retirement and when RMDs begin, this is what we call your tax planning window. Tax planning window. This is potentially a really good time for you to accelerate Roth conversions, especially if you're projected to have really high distributions in the future because of RMDs and be stuck in those higher brackets. So take advantage of those lower brackets, consider a conversion at that time, okay? Next thing, we have mandatory Roth catch-up contributions. Folks, this is a big thing that is gonna change in 2026, and I think you're gonna wanna be aware of this because there's a couple of details and there's a wide group of people that this is gonna impact. Ready? So here we go. First of all, what is the catch-up contribution? Anyone who is 50 years and older gets to make a larger contribution into the TSP. Except for there's a challenge here now. Starting in January 1st, 2026, anyone with an income that is $145,000 or more, and this number is going to be indexed for inflation over time, any catch-up contributions that they are going to make inside their TSP now has to go into the Roth. Well, why is that a problem? We love the Roth, right? Yeah, except that additional catch-up contribution that you used to get deducted for earlier, now you're forced to pay the taxes regardless of whether you are in a higher or lower tax bracket. So remember before we talked about choosing the timing of when to pay taxes. That's good financial planning, whether pre-tax because you're in a high bracket so you get the deduction, or Roth because now you're in a lower bracket and that's when you want to pay taxes. You don't get to have that choice if you are a higher earner. So a lot of our clients who are still working, this is going to affect a lot of folks here in the DC area or high incoming areas. We work with a lot of SES folks. This is going to impact all of you guys, okay? So something to be aware of. It's not a huge deal, but you do need to be aware about how this is going to affect your taxes overall. Now, of course, the benefit of that is, hey, this money is going to be tax-free all the way and forevermore. And so I think that that is a nice benefit overall. So really the planning tip here, if you're a higher earner, it's going to force more of your money to be taxed right now. And so it's a good idea to revisit your tax diversification plan. I always talk about diversifying the taxability of your money as well. So maybe you look at some after-tax monies as well. There's a lot of other strategies that we can use to potentially help with this, some of which I'm going to cover here in the next slide, so we'll keep moving forward. Okay, this next one is a relatively quick change. We're looking at a Lifecycle fund update. So what's going on in 2026? Well, the L 2025 fund is now going to become the L income fund. Why is that important? Well, because it changes the actual percentage and allocation of how the TSP is allocated within the 5 core funds. It's not a huge difference, but it does become slightly more conservative. It is very, very heavily weighted into the G fund, which, as we all know, is a cash-like kind of investment. So you need to understand the impact of that on your long-term plan. So if you're using the life cycle funds, make sure you take another look in there and see whether your choices are still appropriate. Okay, moving on. We also have some new digital tools that the TSP is going to be offering to federal employees in 2026. So one of which is coming with the Roth conversion. There's going to be a conversion tax estimator, from what I understand, or some sort of tool that allows you to try and get ahead of the planning required for the Roth. And then there's also going to be some additional tools around withdrawal planning so that you understand the taxes and things like that. Folks, I'm really happy to see this because historically federal employees were required to go to other tools or work with financial planners to really understand the impact of their decisions. And the addition of these tools, I think, is a really important step to start helping people think about these issues before they're actually just pulling the trigger on making a decision. So when we're looking at, potential RMDs and what that could look like, these are some projections and tools that the TSP is going to have available for you inside the TSP platform. So planning tip here, folks, is don't ignore these tools. I think they're going to be a very good option for you to look at and incorporate into your planning. But I have to say, like many other DIY tools out there, you have to be careful with the output. I would generally recommend that you don't rely on that as the sole planning. I've seen plenty of these tools out there, and the problem is that the output is seldom completely accurate. You see, financial planning software is really only as good as the data that's being inputted and the way that it's factoring all of the other pieces that are being influenced. For example, if you do a Roth conversion or you take withdrawals out, does the software incorporate how much your tax bracket is and your deductions that you're incorporating? Does it include all of the IRS code to factor in different possible deductions that you have? And that's where these softwares tend to be a little bit difficult to use. So it's a good starting point to get the conversation rolling, but don't rely on that as the final say. Plus, I will tell you, the TSP is not going to be quick to give you too much information because it could be misconstrued as advice, and they don't want to go down that road. Okay, the next one here, 2026, we've got the OBBBA, which is again, One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and new planning considerations for 2026. Folks, this is going to be a big year for tax planning. If you've not already started to do this, there were a lot of provisions in OBBBA that created more planning opportunities for federal retirees. Things like the increased SALT deduction. So if you're doing a Roth conversion, you're increasing your taxes. Well, if you're increasing your taxes, it would be nice to qualify for the additional SALT deduction cap, which used to only be $10,000. Now it's increased all the way to $40,000. So some good planning tips around this would be maybe pair a larger Roth conversion with the higher SALT deduction. And in order to do this, you may have to consider itemizing. So what if you don't have enough deductions to itemize? Well, there's bunching of deductions that might be enough to get you to itemize. There's the use of donor advised funds. That's a tool that has been very popular and may allow somebody to donate a little bit to get huge tax savings. And the idea is you want to be able to save more in taxes than you are donating. Okay, you don't want to be too haphazard with some of these strategies, but so many more planning opportunities. And I think too, as we see the continuation of the existing tax brackets, folks, if we look back in history, we are in a historically low tax environment right now. We've got a pendulum swing that goes back and forth between very low and very high. And so right now we're in a very low tax environment. You may consider doing some accelerated Roth conversions, paying the taxes right now while we have the brackets that we have. Because what's going to happen in the future? Okay. We know that Social Security has some issues in terms of funding. Well, in essence, if they increase funding to Social Security, what is that to you? A tax. We know that there's issues around Medicare. We know that there's issues around the national debt. How are we going to solve these? Well, without getting political, more tax. And so you have to be thinking ahead of this because later in retirement, you're going to have a tax bill throughout your life that you're going to want to have wanted to work on all throughout early retirement. Figure out how much income you're going to need. How is your portfolio going to create that? And then how do you do that while keeping taxes as low as possible? Okay, so what do we do now? I want to leave you guys with a couple of action items just to get you started on your planning. First of all, number one, review your tax brackets. You need to build your retirement plan inside a software that allows you to see what is your expected tax liability in the future. On the screen, I'm going to throw an example of the software that we use with clients to help them understand where is their expected tax bracket, where should they do a Roth conversion, how far they should convert into which bracket, and starting to bring the plan together. Next, you want to look at your savings mix. Okay, if you're going to be doing Roth conversions, how are you paying for the taxes? If it's happening in the TSP, well, you don't have a choice. It's going to have to come out of the withholdings from there. But you're still going to owe taxes on the state tax if you live in a state that taxes income. If you're losing the catch-up contribution that was once pre-tax, now it's Roth, well, you may have a slightly higher tax bill. So are you prepared to be able to pay for these taxes come the filing of the following year? 3, You want to take a look at your allocation, whether it is the TSP Lifecycle funds that are shifting because we've got a new year here, or it's because you're getting closer to retirement. How are you using your investments differently for retirement than you were before? Before retirement, the only job your portfolio had was grow and grow aggressively. As you get closer to retirement, you have to protect what you've built, but still outpace inflation and replace your spending. So you can't take too much volatility risk, but you also can't be too conservative. So what is that right mix? The way to determine that mix is not watching CNBC, love those guys, but it's not watching the news. It is creating a plan to understand how much money am I going to need for the rest of my retirement, anticipated, adjust that for inflation, factor taxes, and then determine what kind of allocation does my portfolio need to have to create that income so that I can live my life in retirement the way that I want. That is the right way to create a portfolio strategy. And 4, I just have to put the disclaimer in here. Guys, please talk to your financial professionals about this stuff. When you start to incorporate tax planning and distribution plans and Roth conversions, the complexity goes from here, just being a regular W-2 employee, through the roof. Okay? You can ask any retired Fed who's been doing a lot of good planning and adding a lot of value through that planning. The complexity goes up. And so you want to make sure that you're talking to possibly your tax preparer. Okay? You don't necessarily need one, but I do think it's important. But definitely your financial planner. There needs to be a single quarterback to understand all of the pieces and how they all correlate together. So before you go making tons of changes, do yourself a favor, make sure you're doing the homework, okay? If you choose not to work with a professional, I respect that and I understand that. Please make sure that you're understanding all of the different laws that are impacting together on any one of these things that we talked about. Okay, so this was a very high level presentation today. We're going to start digging deeper into bigger changes that are coming writ large and also some intricacies about the specifics of these. So if you're not yet subscribed, now is your chance to do so. We talk a lot more about financial planning strategies specifically for federal employees and those retiring. So make sure you get on our subscription list so you get updates about this. Until next time, stay wise and stay wealthy.